Okay, so anyway, we've spent some time looking at this draft interim constitution for Scotland, some of us a little more than others. I'm really pleased that the person who drafted the first one and then did the third version, right, based on input, Dr. Bulmer, and who has written extensively, knows a lot about constitutions, and currently is starting to work on the Belize new constitution. So he's in Delft, the Netherlands, and we're really glad to have him here. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Elliot. We had talked about some things for you to go on about, so on you go. Thank you. You're on mute.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So I've been doing work towards a Scottish constitution since about 2007. And this has been running in parallel with my actual day job, which is I work for an intergovernmental organization, and I advise countries on major constitutional change, right? So it might be after a revolution, at the end of a civil war, when a country becomes independent, or what often happens is when a country is saying, you know, we've had this constitution now for 50 years, it's kind of working, there's some things that are not, we want to review it. Then they call me up and I go help them. I'm here today in a purely personal capacity, not affiliated with my organization. But between these two things, between what I've done in Scotland and what I've done around the world, I've spent a lot of time helping people to understand what the Constitution is, why the Constitution matters, and how to go about the process of writing a Constitution or revising a Constitution, and what kind of things you might put in it, and what the consequences of those decisions might be. When I first started doing this work in Scotland, there was a lot of hostility and a lot of pushback. The focus is just on independence, the constitution will come later, we don't need to worry about that now, it's only a cause for division, let's not open that whole can of worms, the UK doesn't have a written constitution and it's kind of worked, so why bother? That was the majority response. Now actually I see over time the prevailing attitude has changed. I think most people now on the pro-independence side recognize that having a constitution, a written constitution, is not an option. It is a necessity. And it's a necessity that has to be in place from day one. And there's lots of reasons for that. One is about internal reassurance. How do we know that a Scottish government is going to be a democratic government that respects human rights and the rule of law? It might be that because we trust the party in power. But the very nature of party politics is that people have different parties that they support, and that support ebbs and flows. The post-independence period is always a very difficult time for a country. And so I think there is a need for internal reassurance to key sectors of the Scottish electorate that their rights will be protected and that at least in terms of democracy, things will get no worse. I'm thinking here in particular about the role of reassurance that it gives to those who are not necessarily pro-independence. Because if independence happens, the Scottish state cannot be a state only for nationalists. It's a state for all Scottish citizens, including Scottish citizens with accents like mine. And the need, therefore, is to reassure people that they can have a place in this independent Scotland, that this is a country which is going to protect their democratic rights within a state that serves the public interest. So that's the first point about internal reassurance. So some of that is electoral, some of that is about appealing to the soft nose and the undecideds who may have all sorts of fears. Now, these fears are, they may seem imaginary to us, right? But if you remember, before the 2014 referendum, some idiot in a TV studio in London came up with this giant coin with Alex Salmond's face on it. Right? This is what the Scottish currency is going to be. And they put Alex Salmond's face on a coin. Now, that is a basic constitutional misunderstanding because it assumes that there's no distinction between the government of the day and the state as such. And that scares people. And remember, everyone in this room is highly atypical. The referendum in 2014 was lost, I think, by low information voters. You remember that man on the telly advert. So there has to be a good constitutional answer to this question of how do we prevent the Scottish state becoming a one-party state? That's the rhetoric, right? How do we stop this being personalized? Well, what the Constitution does is it publicizes power. It makes power bound by the public. It makes power belong to the public. It is, if you like, the people's title deeds by which they have the freehold of the state. And it makes the government of the day into tenants. Scotland is also a country which is deviled by the resource curse. I don't know if you've come across this concept, but the idea that actually having oil and gas wealth is a problem rather than a benefit. It can lead to all sorts of distorting influences. I'm sure that if we didn't have oil and gas, we would have been independent 20 years ago. But anyway, that's a side issue and it's speculative and I probably shouldn't go there. But the point is that is a threat to the new state. Foreign countries will be very interested in us and will try and influence Scottish politics. The tendency to use oil and gas wealth, and it's still there, and there's still quite a lot of it, to buy support is a common tactic amongst fragile and authoritarian regimes. Again, the Constitution is necessary to provide a reassurance to all of those who worry about such things. But no country is an island. And I think in practical and economic terms, Scotland's independence is predicated upon actually a different and wider union. And so an independent Scotland would, probably out of principle, but certainly out of economic necessity, need much closer ties with the European Union than the sort that we're going to get in Brexit Britain. That may be full EU membership, it may be EFTA membership. There will have to be a conversation around what exactly that looks like, but we will need to have the respect and trust of our European partners. Also, as we've seen, it's a dangerous world out there. Scotland occupies a vital strategic position in the, I suppose, the sort of, the North Atlantic and the North Sea. Any Russian submarine that's coming out of Murmansk and heading into the North Atlantic needs to come past Scotland one way or another. And so we also need to reassure our allies, right? We need to be quite practical and hard-headed about that, because if powerful leaders of the Western Alliance see an independent Scotland as a security risk, then they won't support it. They don't care what the people of Scotland think, really. They care about the security of NATO. So we have to convince our European partners economically and our Atlantic partners strategically that an independent Scotland is going to be a good team player, a reliable partner, and a country that they can trust. And we have a great advantage here, right? Because certainly on the European dimension, less so on the Atlantic dimension, trust in the UK at the moment is very low. And I've spoken privately to several European diplomats, and they recognize the position of Scotland. They recognize the election, the Brexit referendum result. They recognize that Scotland is not culpable or liable for what has happened in the UK over the last 6 or 7 years. But still, we need to make a case that Scotland is going to be a stable, democratic, functioning country. And the Constitution is essential to that, because the Constitution it's a law, right? But it is a supreme and fundamental law. It's supreme because it's above other laws. So if an act of the Scottish Parliament is against the Constitution, then the Constitution prevails. And it's harder to change than other laws. So the government of the day can't just change the Constitution easily and quickly and unilaterally. There has to be a process. There has to be some wider agreement. If I was going to put it in Declaration of Arbroath terms, I'd say you have to go back to the whole community of the realm, because the Constitution is that sort of social compact between the whole people. It's also a fundamental law because it concerns the fundamentals of the state. What are the principles upon which the state is founded? How is it governed? Who gets to vote? How are rights protected? And because of that, constitutions sometimes have to go into a fair amount of detail. Because if you look at how backsliding or authoritarian states try to undermine constitutional rights, they'd often do it quite subtly. So we need things in the Constitution like protecting the independence of the Electoral Commission and preserving the system of meritorious appointments in the civil service, preventing the civil service just being used as a sort of swamp of patronage. And these are things that we've seen under attack in the UK. We've seen attempts to curtail the power and independence of the Electoral Commission. We've seen an undermining of the professional ethos of the civil service, really an attack against the institutions. And if you look at how the UK is governed at the moment with its unwritten constitution, it's not run by grown-ups, right? It's people playing at a game and making it up as they go along. And I think that there is, and it probably comes from, you know, the country's Calvinist history, but I think there is a strong sense in Scotland that that's just not how things are done. That there's a way in which we should run organizations with a certain degree of probity and integrity and procedurality. Is that a word? Procedurality? Procedural propriety. That's what I mean. Procedural propriety. That the British state does not exemplify. So for all of those reasons, we need to have a constitution. It's not an optional extra. It's not, oh, we'll wait and leave that till after independence. This is something that is vital to reassuring people, reassuring the markets as well, to winning the referendum, or whatever that vote, whatever that decision-making moment is, to engaging people in the discussion about what they want the future of their country to be, which is another very important part of it, and also reassuring our friends and allies upon which we will depend to get through the transition to independence and beyond. So that's the kind of the what and the why. And now we'll talk about the how and the when. Lots of countries have become independent from British rule over the course of history. The usual practice, the normal way that that would happen, is a country would have its own parliament, right? Or legislative assembly, or whatever it was called. And a pro-independence majority would be elected. And the election of the pro-independence majority would be the signal that the British government accepted as a legitimate mandate for independence. So all this talk about how do we get a decision for independence? Well, historically, within the British Empire, we already have that mandate because there already is a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. And that was normally enough to trigger the process. Then what would happen is their head of government would call up London and they'd say, we'd like to be independent, please. And London would go, yes, certainly, of course. The British Commonwealth runs on consent. You have an absolute right to become independent at a time of your own choosing. That's the way things have worked since the First World War. Even in the cases where the British were hesitant about independence, it was only about timing and about process. It was never about the principle of the thing. So for 100 years now, the British Empire worked on the principle that if you wanted to become independent, London was not going to stand in your way. And I find it very odd that a different standard is applied to the inner empire of the Hanoverian state that was built within these islands to that which was applied to the outer empire. And I don't see any logical connection why Scotland should have fewer rights than Jamaica or less status than the Solomon Islands. So that's slightly parenthetical, but the point is there would then be a conversation. You want to become independent, fine. How are we going to do that? Well, you're going to need a new constitution because naturally a state needs a constitution at the point that it becomes independent. The British government understood that. They didn't apply it to themselves because they're all good chaps and they don't need rules to bind them because they all went to the right schools and they all know each other. But for the rest of the world, for mere fallible mortals, we needed written rules to live by. And so what would happen is they would get together and they would get the parties in the devolved parliament of the country that's becoming independent. They would send some civil service lawyers and together they would write a constitution. And that constitution would come into effect on Independence Day. And if you go back and look at the old Pathé newsreels, it's quite a fun thing to do. You'll see how much the British government loved giving countries their independence. Couldn't get enough of it. The band plays and some minor royal marches on, and the Governor General's there and the bayonets come out and they all line up and children sing and dance and they wave the flag. And what happens at midnight is the Royal Marines band plays God Save the Queen, the Union Jack comes down, the new national flag goes up, they then play the national anthem of the new country, and then you get and you can watch the Pathé newsreels, they do this, And they said, and now, you know, His Royal Highness hands over the constitutional instruments. And those constitutional instruments mark the transition from submission to the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament to independent statehood. And they would generally, what it would be an order in council establishing independence, plus the constitution of the new state. So that was the process. And the vast majority of countries that became independent from the British Empire, with the exception of with the exception of 3 or 4, went through that process. The point of that I'm trying to say here is not only that for the British government to deny a country independence is unprecedented and and unconventional, but also that they did their constitution building before independence. And you can look, I mean, I'm working on the Constitution of Belize at the moment. You can go back and you can look at these debates, right? They had they had this conference where the parties came together to negotiate the constitution. They produced a report that was then debated in Parliament, in the Belizean, or British Honduras as it was at the time, Parliament. It went out for public consultation. They digested all of that. They made some amendments, and the thing was then approved by the Belize Parliament. And then it was issued in London. And all the constitution making was done beforehand. So that at that point, the constitution could come into effect. There were some countries where that didn't happen, and where constitution making, for whatever reason, couldn't happen before independence. Sudan was, I've just spent the last year of my life working in Sudan. They've never got over it. Right? Sudan has had a very different history from many other countries that became independent from the UK, in that they became independent really in a hurry because of events that were going on in Egypt. I won't bore you with the details, but they didn't get a constitution in place before independence, and they never have since. And they've gone from they've cycled through various forms of authoritarian government, and they're still in a mess because they never figured out the fundamentals beforehand. Then you have the sort of India approach. And India did its constitution making in 2 stages. First of all, it recognized that there needed to be a constitution in place on Independence Day, but that wouldn't necessarily be the final constitution under which they would live. That it would be a transitional constitution. And so they went through a process of pre-independence constitution making. They became independent in 1947. Under that, as it was the Government of India Act 1947, they then established a Constituent Assembly, which adopted the constitution the permanent constitution in 1950. The reason that I've gone into this long sort of discussion of colonial history and post-colonial history is firstly to say that the British government has a long experience of giving countries their independence. Sadly, all the people who worked on this have long since retired and mostly passed away. So there's no institutional memory left. But I'm raising it because those are the options. It's pre-independence constitution making, post-independence constitution making, or an a 2-stage process that straddles independence. And I think that we need to have that 2-stage process. This has been the position of the SNP. It's the position of Mike Russell, who's leading their constitution approach. And it's a position that I came to probably about 5 years ago or more as the most practical option. The reason that it's the most practical option is that we can't get everybody in the room to do pre-independence constitution making. I would be really happy to have a constituent assembly now or a constitutional convention now, and to hammer out a constitution and to say, this is the prospectus for independence. We will become independent on that constitution. You hold the referendum, and then on Independence Day, that constitution comes into effect. I would love to do that. It's the simplest, quickest, easiest way, which causes the least disruption and the least opportunity for things to go horribly wrong. And things do go horribly wrong, by the way. About 80% of constitution making processes fail. So to get it right before independence is really helpful. The problem with that is that any constitution written under such conditions would exclude roughly half the population. And like it or not, you know, Scotland will include Tories too. And a constitution that works for the country is a constitution that Tories can live with. It's a constitution that unites rather than divides. Every time a constitution becomes a partisan weapon, it fails. And my fear is that if we try to do pre-independence constitution making, excluding that other half of the population, we might end up with a constitution that's technically very good. We might end up with a constitution that is very radical and that pleases a lot of the radical edge of the independence movement, but then fails because it doesn't compromise. It doesn't bring the other half with us. Now, there's a real danger of that. If you look at something like the Weimar Republic, the Weimar Republic had an incredibly interesting and progressive constitution. But the established elites completely rejected it. The army officers, the judges, the senior civil servants, none of them wanted anything to do with it. And that made it very easy to mobilize against that constitution in authoritarian ways. Another example would be the Spanish constitution in the 1930s when they created the Spanish Republic. Very progressive constitution. What did it produce? It produced a military uprising, a civil war, and 40 years of right-wing dictatorship. In the 1970s, when the Spanish came to rewrite their constitution, and I realized the Spanish constitution is not very well received in Scotland because of what it has to say about Catalonia and the events in Catalonia. But that is a constitution which has given Spain its longest period of democratic stability in history. Why? Because they made strategic compromises. So if a constitution represents the settled will of the people, if it represents the agreement of the whole community of the realm, then it has to be something that tries to find the common ground. It's not a party manifesto. It's not a set of detailed policy prescriptions. It's not a place where you can grind ideological axes. It's the framework, it's the rules, it's the foundations, it's how we're going to make decisions. And we try to build a consensus around that. So if we can't do that before independence, because the other half won't get involved in the conversation, then we need to have a two-stage process where we, the pro-independent side, who are offering the prospectus of an independent state, need to sit down and we need to come up with a transitional constitution that is not the constitution we want. It is not the constitution that is most necessarily aligned with our ideological goals or policy goals. It is a constitution that in our best judgment is most likely to be viable and acceptable and to perform that reassuring, unifying, stabilizing role to get us through the transition period. We can then in a post-independence environment, when the question of Scotland's status as an independent state is no longer in doubt, reopen that constitution, and then look at building, if you like, the permanent constitution with a more inclusive and participatory process. So what I envisage is that the interim constitution would contain within it a process for building that permanent constitution. There would be a requirement in that interim constitution for some kind of citizens' constitutional assembly or whatever that would carry out the next stage of the process. So that two-stage process has been accepted, as I say, by the SNP. I had a conversation with Alex Salmond when he was First Minister before the 2014 referendum, in which he committed to that process. And there's never been I mean, they don't say very much about these things, but there's never been a formal sort of retraction of that under Nicola Sturgeon. And as I understand it, that is the process that is now being followed. So my brief was to produce a draft constitution for an interim constitution, a draft for an interim constitution. Now, in terms of the timelines for getting from an interim constitution to the permanent one, I think it's just worth bearing in mind that the post-independence period will be really busy. There'll be a lot of things on the plate of the first independent government. There is the disentangling of the economy from the British state and model to rediscover its European dimension. So reintroducing all the EU rules that will have been scrapped, right? That's going to be a thing. There'll be passports and customs and embassies and currency. All of those things that diplomacy, foreign affairs, will absorb a lot of the Scottish government's time. Yeah, there might be holdout states that don't recognize Scotland. Right, so we'll need to marshal our allies and do deals to get that. There's the whole Faslane issue. This is another thing, right, that we need to understand in practice about becoming independent. When countries became independent from the British Empire, they very often accompanied independence with a defense agreement and often a financial agreement. This was done in Malta, in Ceylon, as then was Sri Lanka, and in other places. If the British state sees Scotland as a place to park its nuclear submarines, and if it sees independence as a threat to its ability to park its nuclear submarines, then it will oppose independence because it's a strategic risk. If we can do some deal whereby, hey, you're going to give us lots of money to park your submarines here, and we're going to create a base area where you can do that, and you can have a 50-year lease on it, which gives you time to, you know, what's left of the UK will not be able to afford nuclear submarines in 50 years' time, right? They're going to go through a really tough time, which is why we need to disentangle, because otherwise it's being wedded to a corpse. But there will be things like that have to be negotiated. And I know that that's not what people want to hear. I know that that's not good politics, but it is necessary statecraft. So anyway, it's a busy time. the last thing we want to be trying to do in that initial period is also trying to come up with a new constitution. So I think we need to have an interim constitution that isn't just good for day one, but would actually get the Scottish state perhaps through the first 5 or so years of its existence before we can say, look, we've been through the first electoral cycle, we've had the second post-independence general election, we've got our passports now and our currency now and our candidate status for EU membership now. Now is the time to actually reopen the constitution. So we need an interim constitution that's good enough for that period. Okay, I've kept you there for 35 minutes, and I've rattled through quite a lot quite quickly. I'm happy now to go through the actual text of the draft, if that's helpful.
Did you want to take a break or do the text and then take a break?
Can we take a quick break now? Can we take a 5 minute
Let's take
now?
a 5-minute break. Some of us will stay online. Thanks,
It
Elliot.
also gives people an opportunity to think of any questions or comments that they might have.
Okay.